the more I learned about how much harm our current approach is causing, the more I started looking for what actually reduces the harm, not just what makes me feel good, not just what makes me feel righteous, not just what makes me feel like I'm telling everybody the best way to live, but how do we actually save lives? How do we actually help fewer people get bloodborne diseases?
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me on the Gift of Need podcast. I'm Jude DiMeglio Trang. I'm the host and an author and an observer of human need in society. And this podcast seeks to address the overlooked power of our need and how it can shape our relationships, our communities, and society as a whole. And I hope to just whet your appetite to get you rethinking when a need comes up in your life, how it cannot be a burden, but it's an opportunity and a gift. And I do that with great guests, like my guest today. Christina Dent is the author of Curious, a foster mom's discovery of an unexpected solution to drugs and addiction. And she's returning as we continue to discuss addiction. And today, specifically, we're going to talk about why we need to reconsider better paths to recovery, because we have a lot of them that are not working in this country. So, hi, Christina.
Hey, Jude. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, I'm so glad you made the time for us. Today, we're going to continue our conversation that we had with Christina last time about rethinking how people become addicted to substances, and we're going to move on to discuss addiction recovery and why we need better options to gain lasting recovery for those struggling with addiction. So Christina founded the nonprofit End It for Good in 2019, which aims to elevate health-centered approaches to addiction policy and public education efforts. And here's what we already know, just to sum it up. For decades, America has tried to combat the harms of drug mainly through prohibition and the criminal justice system for people using them, not just for drug dealers. This is people's personal use. We've been taught that people made a choice to start drugs, and so they should darn well make a choice to just stop them. And just as easy as that, right? What we know, the facts, especially after the ravishing effects of the opioid epidemic for the past 25 years, is that addiction to the powerful drugs that are currently on the market, these are different drugs than were available in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s. That's not something a person can just stop on their own. They need some help. They just can't walk away from them to be free. So, Christina, why did you call your organization End It for Good? What are you working toward to try to end?
Yeah, so that came from thinking about what is our goal. Our goal is to end this criminal justice approach to drugs. So some people would call it the drug war, some people call it drug prohibition and criminalization. Those aren't words we typically use in everyday talk. So we really this idea of using the criminal justice system to try to solve this problem of drugs, whether it's banning drugs or arresting consumers, kind of the whole gamut of the components of this topic of substance use. That we want to end this criminal justice approach to drugs, but we want to do that for good. It's a play on words there, the ending it for good. We don't just want to end it forever. We want to end it because we believe ending it is actually going to lead to good things. It will be a better outcome. It will be a better world for good reasons. We want to do this. So yeah, that's where we came up with End It for Good.
That's great. Great description. So why is it so hard for people to understand the real physical and mental psychological problems with addiction?
I think we like things that are simple, especially in the West, maybe especially in the US. We want quick, simple fixes. We want everything to be simple. We want an easy button for everything. And we are uncomfortable with long-term things. We're uncomfortable with gray, with uncertainty, with ups and downs. That just is not, I don't think anybody loves an experience of lots of ups and downs over many years. But I think especially our culture that is so individualistic and so focused on happiness and how quickly can you get better. We really struggle with the long-term challenges that people face, whether that's addiction or, many other things. Thinking about things like uh, significant disabilities that people might have. The experience is often one of loneliness, of the world is kind of moved on. We focus on who is doing well and can keep up and who can accomplish things, and who can, maybe we're okay with them sharing a little struggle here or there, but most generally we're not comfortable with that. We want people to get their stuff together and just move on and
Right.
and
Pull
be okay.
yourself up by your own
Yeah,
bootstraps,
absolutely.
right?
Pull it.
Right.
Yes,
That's it.
yes,
Right.
and that is challenging.
Yeah. And so it's this mentality that has caused America to use the criminal justice system, the incarceration of, parents and families, and it splits them, and that was something that prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation to address what's really a public health issue, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's an outworking of kind of trying to find an easy button answer. It's an outworking of seeing addiction as a moral failing or a lack of character. Those are all components of how we have come to use the criminal justice system as the primary means of addressing this problem. And I think part of it is also that to face the challenge that addiction really is, that it can be many years of struggling, that it can be absolutely devastating, is a really hard reality to face. We don't want that to be the experience of people. And I think, that could be in a positive way. We don't want people to suffer for a long time, but we also don't want to have to figure out how to engage with that also. Whether that's loved ones trying to figure out how to interface with their loved one who is struggling, or whether it's even friends of people who have a child who might be struggling with an addiction. That's just a really difficult thing for us to kind of say, you know what, we are going to engage in this messy up and down with no guaranteed outcome at the end. Gosh, that's really hard. It's hard for everyone involved. And we would much rather that there be a quick fix to that. And that if we just tell people not to use drugs, they won't use them. If we just give them a slap on the wrist, if we catch them, they'll stop using them. If we give them a harder slap on the wrist, then they really will stop using them. And if they haven't gotten their act together, then we just need to get them out of the community. And we just give them incredibly long prison sentences so that they are just removed and we don't have to think about it anymore. And we don't have to address it anymore because they're out of sight. And now we can move on.
Yeah, I think that is such a clear, concise explanation for the mentality that we have in America. So now, would you explain what harm reduction means and is, and what medicated assisted treatment means?
Yeah. So we think of there's, different definitions of harm reduction. I think the most helpful way to think about it is just to think about what is the best way to reduce harm. And I think for most of my life, I would have thought, well, it's obvious. The best way to reduce harm is you just ban everything and then you threaten people with an arrest. And then that solves the problem. They won't use the drugs and then off we go. But that is really a idealistic approach. It is this idea that, if we just hold a hammer over people's heads, we can force them to do what we want them to do. And if we bang the hammer on them a little bit, that will get them in shape. And what we found is that approach has actually set off an explosion of harm. We have massive amounts of crime and violence from underground markets, tens of thousands of people dying from contaminated drugs they bought on the street, tens of thousands of people sitting in prisons and jails every single day on minor, nonviolent, drug-related charges. So it is not a costless approach to use the criminal justice system. The threat is not effective. We can look at what has happened and say, wow, we have paid a really, really heavy price to use this threat, and it really hasn't been effective. We got, I think it's about 17% of American adults have used an illegal drug in the last year. You can't look at that and say this has been effective, that after 100 years of shaking the hammer, almost 1 in 5 are using a substance. So we've got to look at other solutions and thinking about pragmatically, how do we reduce harm in a world that has suffering people and substances that can cause harm, but people use them anyway because they like the way that those substances make them feel, even if it's just for a short time. And that's really this shift, I think, that happened for me, was the more I learned about how much harm our current approach is causing, the more I started looking for what actually reduces the harm, not just what makes me feel good, not just what makes me feel righteous, not just what makes me feel like I'm telling everybody the best way to live, but how do we actually save lives? How do we actually help fewer people get bloodborne diseases? How do we help fewer people struggle with addiction? And how do we help them overcome that more quickly? And that's really the idea behind harm reduction, is that we're looking at the behaviors people are engaged in, and we're trying to figure out how can we reduce harm from that. We do that in all kinds of ways. You think about going swimming. Well, you reduce harm by teaching people how to swim. Then you have a lifeguard on duty. Then you've got life jackets for people that don't feel comfortable swimming. We have all sorts of ways to reduce harm from the risky activity of open water, where you can drown in a matter of moments. We have reduced harm from driving. Driving is really risky. We let people go flying down the highway at 16 years old in a couple of ton vehicle. Are we insane? No, we've decided, you know what, this is a risky activity, and we're going to approach it with the lens of harm reduction. We're going to use speed limits. We're going to use airbags. We're going to have people take tests before they get their license.
Don't forget seat belts, because
seat belts.
When there were no seat belts, and my mom would throw her arm in front of us when she had to make a quick stop, as if we wouldn't sail through the windshield.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So we had seat belts when I was growing up, but we didn't use them. In our family, you only had to wear seat belts if you were sitting in the front seat. Apparently, the back seat was not dangerous at all.
Right.
So the best with the back seat, you'd have to wear them. So that's really harm reduction. So how can we apply that to substance use and addiction? Well, we can look for what are ways that we can help keep people alive. That might be fentanyl testing strips. It could be Narcan, making sure that is stocked and people have access to that. It could be medications that can help them stop using drugs they bought on the street and be able to be stable. For many people, methadone or buprenorphine can help them do that. And those have been proven to help more people stay engaged in treatment and have less risk of death than just trying to go abstinent. So if you are a family member, I think your number one goal, whether or not you've really thought through this, I know you want, I think the thought is, my number one goal is my loved one is abstinent and thriving, and we don't ever have to think about this again. But really, your number one goal is that your loved one doesn't die. That's the number one goal in the world that we live in today, where death is so common from contaminated substances that people use. So how can we help people stay alive? Then how can we help them be able to take a step forward at whatever pace and whatever timing they're willing to take a step forward in their own health? And that I hope is one of the shifts that we can make, is stop thinking about addiction and sobriety as the only two options out there, that either you're in chaotic active addiction or you have somehow made this quantum leap overnight to this healthy, thriving life with no substances in it. That is gosh, that it's nearly impossible to do, and we're losing so many people who are trying to make that quantum leap.
Yeah.
Can we shift to think about how can they stay alive? How could they be a little more stable today than they were yesterday or last month or last year? How can I um how can I support, how can I celebrate the small steps that they're taking instead of, withholding my love or withholding my um encouragement until they get the whole way there. Those are changes that we can make to really think about it as how can we reduce harm and think about these stair steps we want people to take and kind of celebrate each of those steps along the way.
So I'd like you to explain to us why we need to focus on the goal of recovery and not the tools people use to get there. And I have, in discussions with people, have some people feel like, well, isn't that just the ends justify the means, which we were taught, you don't do that, right? It says some actions are inherently wrong, regardless of their outcomes. But are we asking, are these unconventional options inherently wrong, really? Or do they have their place in a medical public health approach to addiction recovery, right? Just like you think again of modern medicines that are poison if you take them for the wrong thing or in the wrong dose. And they can cause harm or death, right? But when used in the right dosage, they can be good. So, you know, uh, i- i- focusing on the goal of recovery and not the tools is important, right?
Yes. And I think one of the reasons why we have focused so much on the tools, and I'll give a little caveat. I am not against AA. It has been helpful for many people.
Right.
But I think most people have the perception that AA works almost 100% of the time. If you go to the meetings, you will stay sober. Um, and that is not the case. About 10% of people are successful in AA, which means there's a 90% relapse rate. That's 9 out of 10 for whom it is not able to, they're not able to stay abstinent. Now, one of the challenges with some of the people who teach the principles of AA, they will say, well, that's the participant's fault. The program works 100% of the time if you work the program, and if it doesn't work for you, that's your fault. And I would say I don't think we approach anything else that way. I think we would call malpractice if we had a diet company who said our program works 100% of the time. And then we found out that actually 9 out of 10 of their patients it didn't work for. And they said, well, that's not the program, it was the patient. So we're not at fault for that. We would say, no, we're going to sue you over that. Like that's not, you can't say that. That is,
Just a note about AA. AA works really well for alcohol. It's, I have found with friends that use it for alcohol. But when it comes to drugs, like you said, 10%. That would be a big percentage in my opinion for people who have any kind of substance use disorder.
yeah.
So,
So it can work for people, but it doesn't work for a whole lot of people.
exactly.
So what are we
So
going to do for all of the other people? Well, we need to have a arsenal of options for people to be able to kind of see what might work for them. If they want to go try AA, great. If they want to go to faith-based recovery, something, great. If they want to do a secular path, that should be available to them. Because the tool that someone uses to get healthier is not, these tools are not uh, morally good and morally bad.
Right.
There's nothing, I would say that there's no moral weight to whether or not you take a medication for a health condition. And some people think you should never take a medication for anything, and I don't think you or I, or probably most of the people listening, would be in that camp. So, I have a friend who has directed a clinic that provides methadone treatment, and he's actually in abstinence recovery himself, but he is a believer in medication and on many other pathways for people to find sobriety. And he said, look, you know where did we get this idea that it is our business what somebody is the kind of treatment someone is engaging in the context of their relationship with their doctor, their healthcare professional who says, "Hey, I think this might work for you or not." We don't need to be all up in somebody's medicine cabinet. I don't know what medications Jude might be taking, nor is it any of my business what medications Jude might be taking. That is your business with yourself and your healthcare provider. Maybe your pastor. I don't know if that's part of what you feel like is significant in your faith, but with addiction, we feel this sort of community right to say, "Oh, no, no, no. I don't just want to know how you're doing today. I want to know how you got there. What are you doing every day? Are you taking any medication? Are you going to a meeting? Are you doing this? Are you doing that?" And I think if we sit back and think about it a minute, I think it will strike us as a little bizarre that we have focused so much on the tools that someone is using instead of saying, "Gosh, you seem like you're doing really well. Like you're healthier, spending time with your family. I'm happy for you. That's great."
Right.
Um, I think that's what we're looking for, and the tools that people use to get there, I think, should be whatever works for them, is the goal. And there are more tools than most of us know about that are out there.
So if marijuana or mushrooms or psychedelics or other restricted drugs help a person stop using other drugs, why don't they just buy it on the underground market themselves?
Yeah, this came up in our last episode. I was telling you about my new friend Kelsey, who found a path to sobriety from addiction to many different drugs, but methamphetamine was the current one she was struggling with, by using medical marijuana legally when it became legal in Mississippi. And I asked her that question because I thought, wait a second, if she was buying meth, certainly she could have bought marijuana on the underground market. Why didn't she just do that? And so I asked her about it, and she said, "Yeah, the problem was the same guy I bought marijuana from was the same guy that sold me meth. So I couldn't disconnect myself from all of those other drugs while I was still engaged in that underground market." But once she was able to get marijuana legally with her medical marijuana card, she was able to leave that whole connection point with the underground market behind. And that's also how she was able to then begin to reduce her use because there were so many more options of ways to take it. It wasn't just smoking it. Now she had the availability of gummies and other things, that's just better for your health, generally speaking. Um, so, I don't think we think often about what people get exposed to when they engage in that underground market. They get exposed to all kinds of things, not just the same person is selling something else and they might end up trying something they never would have bought otherwise. But also there's so much uh, abuse and assault and violence related to that underground market. It's very common for people to experience that as they engage with that underground market. And so the more that we can bring that out of the shadows and allow people to have some consumer protections, quality controlled products, we can regulate who's selling these drugs and how they're producing them and what is in them and how potent it is. That is a win-win for consumers as well as the rest of the community, if there's less of this kind of Wild West underground market that's operating all around them.
Yeah. Well, and states like Colorado and Oregon have gotten, millions or billions, I don't know, of dollars in tax revenue that has gone to public works and, but it just makes it safer, right? You've said that medical marijuana isn't the solution for every addiction or mushrooms or whatever, and legal markets don't solve all the problems, but that you're looking for better solutions, not perfect ones, because there are no perfect ones. And I can say this from personal experience, my husband and I, we were in that camp with our son, John Life. So we found out when he was 15 in the early 2000s that he was using black tar heroin, which came out of Mexico. And he had started using oxys from a friend's parent medicine cabinet in junior high. And of course, then after the prescription ran out, he had to try to buy it, and it was very expensive, $40 a pill. So he could buy black tar heroin, the same dose, for $5. And as he struggled with addiction, he got in and out of his sobriety. He was in pre-law at the university here, and he needed medication-assisted treatment. And he'd been on Suboxone when it first came out in the early, somewhere in the OOs, and they started them on really high doses. And it was harder for him to taper off of that than it was to go through withdrawals from heroin. And so when in 2014, two friends overdosed on Christmas Eve right with him when they were shooting up, and he was frightened, and he came to us and said, I want to stop. I need help. We went to his addiction doctor, and his addiction doctor said he needed to be on Suboxone. And at that time, of course, Suboxone was not covered by insurance. We were out of pocket. Our son couldn't pay for it. And the doctor said to us when we were without our son in the room, he said, if this young man overdoses again, he will overdose to death. But I want you guys to make the choice about Suboxone. Well, we thought the perfect way. We said the best way, he just needed to try harder. And we did not understand how much he longed to be free of that addiction. He had grown up in a normal, stable household. His introduction to drugs had nothing to do with trauma. It was just that experimental. But in that era, experimenting with drugs was not having a joint with your friends in 1970. It was potent Purdue Pharma oxys. Okay, so he went into a sober living home after he went through, withdrawals one more time. And 6 months later, after being clean in a sober living home, he had to have his wisdom teeth. We'd been putting it off. He had them extracted, and we should have just insisted, but he was an adult, that he not have the pain meds. The doctor prescribed him I think 100 oxys for the week before and 2 weeks after, which of course put him back on the road to addiction. And within a week, he died of an accidental heroin overdose at 25. And that, Christina, and we write about this in my book, Opiate Nation, is our biggest regret, that we thought he just needed to try harder. I look now and go, what planet were we on that we thought that to these powerful drugs? But the whole thing with Purdue Pharma didn't come out. Dreamland came out the next year. We were just starting to understand that. And so regrets over that kind of thing, if there's any, and I know we are not the only parents that have that feeling, right?
Yeah, so many parents, and so many loved ones, not just parents, but other, if a friend whose brother passed away of an overdose. But similarly, they, after that, and they began learning, realized, oh, wow, the whole way that we were approaching that relationship was unhelpful and something they really regret. They wish they could redo that. And I love a quote from a friend of mine who I think got it from a therapist. I'm sure that it is, maybe somebody else said it, I don't know. But she said, all of us can only do the best we can with what we know right now. And that's so hard when all of us have regrets of things that we wish that we had done. And particularly when it is something that feels so deeply connected to a loss of a family member, loved one. That's really, really hard. And I was talking to another parent who said, part of learning about what could have been done differently is like a second grief. It's like I'm already grieving the loss of my son. Now I'm grieving that I understand now it didn't have to be that way. Yes. Something could have been different. And so I recognize that and want to hold that space there too, that even what we're talking about and inviting people into can feel like an increased grief, an increased anger over wait a second, all of this contamination is preventable. All of this underground market is preventable. It didn't have to be this way. So why didn't somebody tell me? Why didn't somebody tell me about what was happening, about medications, about other options, about and and that is part of the challenge of living in a broken world. But we are
Yes.
just all doing the best we can with what we know. And as we learn and grow, we can put that knowledge to use. And many parents like yourself are doing that in lots of different ways. Podcasts, serving in the community, being a place for other families, leading support groups, and helping more families as quickly as possible understand the options that are out there for people who are still walking with their loved one and have that opportunity still to kind of shift their approach and shift their mindset around it.
Well, you know, this what comes to mind too. I had a brother in the 90s who had AIDS, and we didn't know he had AIDS. And I think he was experimenting with drugs in the early 80s when before everybody knew about AIDS. And but he was a very high functioning, really intelligent guy, owned his own business. And in 2000, when he collapsed from respiratory failure and was in ICU for 2 months, due to the shame he felt, and we could have a whole other podcast, and I have spoken about this with other people, the shame surrounding, especially at that time, but it's still there, to say, I have a problem with addiction, or I have a problem with high risk behavior. So he never told us. We found out in the hospital after he was put in an induced coma that he was in for 6 weeks. He died after 2 months in ICU because he did not access the drugs that we had for AIDS. And so the same thing with substance abuse, you know, happened with AIDS. We should have learned something. It was, wait a second, we have this drug. Well, it was like, well, why give them drugs? They made that choice, you know? So we just let people die because they made foolish choices to start something. You know, we don't do that. So
Yeah. Yep.
you had on recently on your End It for Good podcast, Colonel Stephen Maxwell, the former director of the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics. And he was trained and practiced in the criminal justice punishment incarceration mode of for drug users and dealers, but his stance has changed. So what insight from that discussion would you like to summarize for us here, Christina?
Yeah, I think it's similar to the experience that I've heard from a lot of law enforcement people, which is, they have often spent careers doing a lot of drug policing. He specifically worked in narcotics, but even if you're just a regular police officer on a beat out in town, you spend a good bit of time doing the enforcement of drug laws. And the challenge for a lot of officers as they age in their career is they look back and go, gosh, we've been doing the same thing over and over and over again. And it hasn't, like, nothing has gotten better in the community. We arrest the same people over and over again. And this feels kind of futile. Like, when you're a young officer, it can feel like I am getting out there. I am really protecting people, and I am making this a great place to live. And I think for the vast majority of officers, their intentions are good. They want to be helpful. They want to serve their community. We have given them a set of laws to enforce that are unhelpful. And I would say creates moral injury for our officers. I think we are asking them to do things that are harmful to people. And we're asking them to bear the weight of that. Are they doing that because they're following orders? Yes. That still doesn't mean that they don't feel the weight of that. We've interviewed on the podcast numerous former officers, some of whom struggle with a lot of guilt over what they participated in. No-knock raids in the middle of the night where they're terrifying children, all in service of enforcing the drug war. I think we can look at that and say, you know what, maybe one of the best ways we could be pro law enforcement is to stop asking them to enforce laws that are not actually improving public safety or increasing people's health. They're not trained mental health professionals. And we're asking them to address a serious mental health issue in addiction. And so, it's gratifying for me to see people rethinking that, whether they are former law enforcement or not. But, one of the things that Colonel Maxwell had talked about especially was just looking for that clinical component when you're talking about addiction. That's what he's looking for now when they're thinking about, he works for our Department of Corrections now, treatment systems and all of that. What is the clinical component? Not just somebody opened a treatment center and says that it works, but are they actually following what we know, that there's some research-backed evidence to what they're doing, that it actually is helpful? And so for people, there's probably people listening who would say, well, I don't have a whole bunch of money to be able to go send my loved one to some posh treatment center or the best treatment center that's out there. So just to give you a couple of tools. So AA is out there. It's free. It's available. It's not the right fit for everyone. There are other mutual aid groups that you can access. There are online options from anywhere in the country. You could look into LifeRing. LifeRing is a secular recovery. There is no higher power component to it. It focuses on helping people build a personalized recovery plan that they're excited about and feel like they can work. There is also Smart Recovery, which focuses on kind of cognitive behavioral therapy tools for people. There's Women for Sobriety. And this is, Jude, I just love this. So one of the things I love about Women for Sobriety is when you introduce yourself at a Women for Sobriety meeting, for one, it's single gender, so it's only women, and that's really helpful for some women who don't want to be in this kind of vulnerable situation with men in the room, which is totally understandable. So at Women for Sobriety, when you introduce yourself, if I was there and I was introducing myself, I would say, my name is Christina, and I am a capable woman. That's the introduction. It's not, I'm an addict. It is their whole thinking behind even the introduction is not calling back to the thing you're trying to leave and get out of. It's calling forward to the person that you are living into. And they really focus on how to be a caring, competent, compassionate. They have a number of different C words. That's what you're building in Women for Sobriety meetings. There was a study that was done on these 4 mutual aid groups: AA, LifeRing, Smart Recovery, and Women for Sobriety. They looked at long-term outcomes, and they found that they have basically the same outcomes for people who participate in them. It's not which one you choose. It's that you find the one that's a good fit for what you're looking for and fits your needs, and you have that community support on this recovery journey. So there isn't just one option. It isn't God or nothing. There are lots of options out there, even free options. All of these are free to access, to get involved in one of these support groups. But they might have tools that are a much better fit for someone than maybe a traditional model would be. And it's very likely it will be just as effective for them.
Yes, and they may get then also the connections for where to access medical support for harm reduction that may not be so expensive, like
Yeah.
you said, like that was one of our options early on with our son was, do we put him in a $30,000 a month recovery program? Well, we found out, first of all, we'd have to mortgage our house. Second of all, we found out that didn't last. That was not a model that worked well. And the long term is what we're looking for, is to reduce the harm and to give people back a life. So, well, we could go on. Thank you, Christina, for taking the time again to be with us today and talk about how the needs that we all have for learning and growing and understanding in areas where we don't have the time or the knowledge to come up with all of the statistics and stuff, but we can learn from others and grow, and then it just fills our need for being involved and helping and serving others. And so thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, Jude. Thanks for inviting me to be here with you and for your work as well. So important.
Thank you. I highly recommend Christina's book, Curious. It's insightful, it's emotional, and it's a necessary read for anyone who's got family or friends or community that are dealing with addiction, which is all of us. We all have, this is a an American societal problem. So you can check out Christina's work and get her book from her enditforgood.com website, or listen to her End It for Good podcast with a bunch of really great people from every field discussing addiction and alternate options for sobriety and health other than the criminal justice system and punitive. So, all right, the great music you're hearing was written and performed by Gabe Kubanda at Kubanda Music. You can find him on any streaming service. Ray Engineering of 3rd Street Productions was the engineer. I hope you will subscribe and follow this podcast and leave any comments or thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Bye.